Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the First Thursday Club from RSK Biocensus. My name's John Davis. I'm a director at Biocensus and head up the RSK Wilding team, which delivers biodiversity net gain. And today, I'm very happy to be introducing a talk all about invertebrates because they're very close to my heart, having done my research on tropical beetles many, many years ago, and having myself tried to incorporate invertebrates into ecological impact assessment over the last 20 or 30 years. So it's going to be very, very interesting for me to hear this talk from Chris. But Chris, if you can just move on to the first slide, or the next slide, I will quickly go through the normal rigmarole of housekeeping. So all of you will have your microphones turned off, but that doesn't mean that we are muting you or cancelling you. You can ask questions, pop those into the Q&A box. I will go through those as Chris is giving his talk, and I will pick out the most taxing ones for him at the end. Chris will talk for about half an hour as normal, and then we'll have hopefully about 15 minutes of questions afterwards. About an hour after the presentation, you'll get an email with a feedback form, and we'd be very grateful if you could fill that in for us. Chris, you can go on to the next slide. So Chris is technical director with us here in Biocensus. He led the Caledonian conservation team until they were subsumed into the behemoth that is RSK Biocensus not very many months ago, and it's great to have you on board, Chris. And Chris, as you will find out, is passionate about invertebrates and getting it done properly in ecology assessments and mitigation. And so without further ado, I think I'll just hand over to you, Chris, and stop warbling. If you want to turn your camera off, I shall do the same, and then I'll leave it over to you.
Thank you very much, John. So, yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Chris Catron. As John mentioned, I used to be Director of Caledonian Conservation for the last 15 years, and we're now part of RSK Biocensus, which is very exciting. And invertebrates are an area I am indeed very passionate about, having previously worked at Buglife and worked with invertebrates for most of my career, which is now over 20 years as a professional ecologist. And an area that I've always had quite a bit of focus on is how to consider them in ecology projects. So whether that's a development or land use change, because it is not a very well defined area at present, although it is firming up. And over the last number of years, I've had a great opportunity to work on a huge number and variety of projects with invertebrates. So before we get into the talk itself, I just want to ask everyone a question, and I realize that nobody can answer it at the moment, but perhaps you will be able to answer it at the end of the presentation. Maybe worth just making a note yourself so as you can remind yourself, because we will go through this again at the end. So I just want you to look at the following pictures of various sites, their different habitats, and think about which of them is likely to support invertebrate communities of conservation importance, and which of these sites you might recommend would require more detailed invertebrate surveys to inform an ecological impact assessment. So number one is some semi-natural broadleaf woodlands with various bits of deadwood and fungi. Number two is some beautiful Caledonian pinewood. Three is a brownfield site, so open mosaic habitat on previously developed land. This is an area of wet grassland. This is peatland. This is a lowland raised bog. Number six is a montane environment. This is another wet habitat with willow and vegetated shingle. So just try and bear those in mind, and we will revisit these sites at the end. So to begin with, why consider invertebrates? Well, they're really important for ecosystem services. The vast majority of ecosystem services that we and other wildlife depend on, the foundation of these services are invertebrates. And I do appreciate that fungi and plants are also integral to that, but invertebrates are an absolutely essential component. And they're responsible for a great deal of pollination, which is high in sort of policy and things at the moment. Soil creation, maintenance, and nutrient cycling, they literally make the soil. Waste management, pest control, and food for other animals. So there we've got a few different animals just to sort of as examples. So we've got a bee beetle, which is a pollinator, a lemon slug, which is involved in waste management, soil creation, a door beetle, which is involved in waste management, and of course a four-spot orb weaver, by weight our largest spider in the UK, which is important for pest control. Spiders, great to have around your house, of course, and also all of these can be food for other animals. If you do want to read more about that type of thing, I've just got a reference there to a paper I wrote quite a while ago now, just giving an overview of the importance of invertebrates in ecosystem services. And of course, aquatic invertebrates are really important for clean water, but that's a whole other talk. We are looking at terrestrial invertebrates today. And they can be keystone species, ecosystem engineers. So this is a Scottish wood ant nest, the largest one that I've ever seen. And wood ants that provide a whole load of services in woodland, and they're so important that they're now beginning to be the focus of reintroduction projects, which I've been involved in several of, to bring them back to areas that they have become extinct in. So these animals help maintain the structure of woodlands, so the structure that might be needed, for example, for capercaillies to be lekking. They control various pest species, their food themselves. They're just absolutely critical to woodland environments. Otherwise, and then on to the hows. So otherwise, that might be more of a material consideration, although I think that ecosystem services are probably fundamentally important compared to legislation. But as it is with a project, we have this framework to work within. So legislation, there is legislative importance, which we'll talk about. There's conservation importance in general, other ways of measuring status. They can fall within the process of preliminary ecological appraisal, or in fact they should do, and obviously should be considered in some form in ecological impact assessment, even if it's scoping them out and explaining why. And mitigation, compensation, and enhancement can also obviously focus on these species if there may be an impact from a proposed project, land use change. How would you go about doing this? Well, as I've mentioned, there's not really a formal structure for this as there are for other species. It's not a one-stop shop guidance document at present, although hopefully there will be one day. But over the course of the last sort of 15 years or so, I've developed an approach which works very effectively and is proportionate, which involves 3 stages. The first being a desk study, which would identify whether or not you might need to do anything else. And stage 2 would be the initial invertebrate site assessment, so visiting a site and assessing whether or not it's likely to support invertebrate communities of conservation importance. And then, depending on the outcome of that, stage 3 would involve detailed targeted surveys for invertebrates. And we're going to go through all of this in a bit more detail. But what are invertebrates? Well, they're the vast majority of species in terrestrial ecosystems. Just for context, 98% of all known terrestrial and freshwater animal species in Scotland are invertebrates. So they are the vast majority of everything in ecology, frankly. And that's a big topic. So obviously you need to come up with a proportionate way of considering these animals. Just as for some sort of examples, we've got butterflies, which are have 59 species in the UK, spiders, over 600 species in the UK, beetles, over 4,000, true flies, over 5,000 species known from the UK. And parasitoid wasps, these are wonderful animals that lay their eggs in or on other invertebrates hosts, and their larvae then develop inside or outside of those hosts. Probably the inspiration of Aliens, I imagine. Anyway, there's over 6,000 species of these known from the UK, and they're incredibly understudied. So basically the point there is there's a lot of invertebrates. On to why we consider them, as we've mentioned: legislation, conservation importance, PEA, ECIA, and mitigation, compensation, and enhancement. In terms of legislation, there's the Habitats Directive, there are European protected species of invertebrate, and there are special areas of conservation designated for invertebrate features. So those are obvious situations where you need to consider invertebrates. The Wildlife and Countryside Act, there are Schedule 5 species of invertebrate, although not proportionately what you might expect given the number of invertebrate species that there are compared to vertebrates. There are sites of special scientific interest designated for invertebrate features. And there's also the biodiversity duty. So that's required for public bodies in the UK to measure how they're considering biodiversity in their decision making, and that's based in the context of, in Scotland, the Scottish Biodiversity List, England and Wales, the various NERC lists, and in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Priority Species List. So they should be considered in decisions, which would include planning decisions and other land use decisions. And there's a pretty picture of a marsh fritillary butterfly, which is a Schedule 5 species. You need a license to survey for this butterfly. I have a license, and it should be considered in the same way as any other species protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And there are sites designated for this species also. There's other ways of measuring conservation importance other than legislation. So there are IUCN red lists, local red data books, and there's various designations that are defined by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and there are local biodiversity action plans. And there's a huge number of different ways that you can consider these, and they can feed into, for example, the SSSI selection criteria, which can be a good context for considering invertebrates as well. But we don't really have time to go into too much detail on that in this talk today, but there are several references there if you do want to follow that up in more detail, and it is something that I run training on. So, considering invertebrates in preliminary ecological appraisal, what is PEA? Well, it's a rapid assessment of ecological features, present or potentially present, and it's normally conducted at an early stage of a project. And the purpose is to inform clients by identifying likely ecological constraints, identifying at an early stage mitigation measures and ecological enhancement opportunities. So this would be at a high level, not the detail that you would get later on down the process, and identifying any additional surveys that may be required to inform an ecological impact assessment. So it really should be the case when a PEA is conducted, invertebrates should be a factor that are considered, whether or not more detailed surveys might be required, whether that's a site assessment or whatever the case may be, scoping them in or out. And then from there down the road, we have ecological impact assessment itself, and that's the process of identifying, quantifying, and evaluating the potential impacts of defined actions on ecosystems or their components. And the purpose of an ECIA is to provide decision makers with the information about likely significant ecological effects associated with the project in the absence and with mitigation. So you really would need to know about invertebrates if they are a factor, or you can't assess them. So you can't assess impacts basically if you don't know what's there in the first place. And this is an example of that, working on a project with Stephen Falk, absolutely top legendary dipterist and bee man. And during the course of this project, we rediscovered a species of fly that had been thought to be extinct for over 100 years and never before recorded in Scotland. And if we hadn't done surveys, we wouldn't have found that, and we wouldn't have known it was there to consider. So ecological impact requires surveys to inform the baseline, and then there's a baseline description and an impact assessment conducted. Invertebrates could be considered in a variety of ways at this stage within the CIEM ecological impact assessment framework. So they could be considered alongside habitats. Habitats are a collection of species that are typical of a particular community, and that could involve invertebrates. If you're looking at a site of relatively, straightforward, typical habitat of not masses of conservation value, not particularly significant value, such as amenity grassland, it may be reasonable to consider invertebrates as part of that habitat rather than individually. That may be proportionate. Or you may want to look at communities. So that could be a situation where you've got habitat that's likely to support invertebrates of conservation importance. So for example, broadleaf woodland. And you would undertake surveys of target taxa that are good indicators for that habitat to inform you of the importance of that community rather than looking at individual species per se. And again, the SSI selection criteria provides a good framework for considering that within. And then you may need to look at individual species. An example of that would be the marsh fritillary that we mentioned earlier on. It's a protected species under Schedule 5 and would warrant its own consideration in an assessment, and targeted surveys for that species would probably be required if there is a risk that you may have an impact on them with whatever land use change you're planning. And then with mitigation, compensation, enhancement, again, you need to know which species you're considering to be able to develop these with any confidence of success. So you need to know what's there. And that the mitigation could involve planting schemes, habitat replacement, maybe brown roofs for replacing brownfield sites, or brownfield habitat being lost, habitat creation, microhabitat creation. Invertebrates are often very much dependent on very particular features within a habitat. So when you're creating a habitat broadly, it's necessary to consider those microhabitats and ensure that they're included, or it may not be suitable for the invertebrates that you hope to occupy it. Or translocation if there's no other alternative. And just as an example, I've been involved in quite a few wood ant translocations in particular, where we've moved nests, also increasingly involved in reintroduction projects associated with them, which obviously involve similar methods at points. But this is just the first of those that I was ever involved in, which was moving a hairy wood ant nest as part of the creation of a new primary school at Aviemore. And we went through a very detailed process, and it was successful. So going back to this 3-stage consideration process with the stage 1 desk study, so gathering data from, say, NBN, local record centres, particular recording schemes. A lot of the different taxa groups of invertebrates have specialist recording schemes. And then, although invertebrates are very poorly recorded compared to other groups, perhaps, quite under-recorded. So absence of records definitely doesn't demonstrate absence of presence. So it's also important to look at habitat data. Sometimes there may be existing phase 1 or NVC data. There may be data sets, for example, Nature Scot have got an NVC data set that's fairly broad for much of Scotland. You can look at you could also consider the aerial photography and habitats that you can identify from that to consider whether or not a site may offer habitats that could support invertebrate communities of conservation importance. And depending on the outcome of that desk study, you may decide that it's worth having an invertebrate expert visit the site and undertake the stage 2 initial invertebrate site assessment, which would involve a more detailed look at those habitats and deciding whether or not they could support invertebrate communities of conservation importance, and then moving on to those detailed surveys targeting particular taxa. And it ensures a proportionate approach that's appropriate to each site and project. So just to focus in a bit more on that stage 2 initial invertebrate site assessment, the purpose is to determine if targeted detailed invertebrate surveys are required, and if so, it would help inform their design. The site visit would be undertaken by a suitably experienced invertebrate specialist or specialists to assess habitat suitability for supporting invertebrate communities of conservation importance. And it's important to note that varied habitat structure is particularly important for invertebrate communities. Although some invertebrate species are linked to particular plant species, the vast majority of invertebrates are far more dependent on the structure of a habitat and microhabitats rather than particular plant species. In fact, there was a study done some time ago now, which looked at predicting invertebrate communities based on habitat data, and that study actually ended up finding that that wasn't possible, but it is possible to predict habitats based on invertebrate data, although I doubt we're all going to replace habitat surveys with invertebrate surveys because they can be quite onerous. So expert judgment is essential for this, but there are some key habitats for invertebrates. There's semi-natural broadleaf woodland and native pine woodland in Scotland, flower-rich grasslands, peatland, wetlands, and open mosaic habitat in previously developed land are all incredibly important for invertebrate communities. Open mosaic habitat is of the same sort of importance, similar importance as broadleaf woodland. And other unusual specialist habitats can be important as well, so mountains, vegetated shingle, macar, high quality heathland, and that sort of thing. And these are just some examples. There's some beautiful peatland habitat in Sutherland in Scotland with some wetland and montane habitats, woodland habitat and wetland, bare earth in a brownfield environment offering good habitat structure, a large area of coastal marshland in the north of Scotland. So a variety of special places there. And although there isn't a sort of set guidance document on this approach, I've developed it over the last 15, 20 years, and it is very effective. In fact, around about 90% of the sites that we identify as requiring further invertebrate surveys using this stage 2 initial invertebrate site assessment end up being of SSSI quality when we conduct the targeted surveys, so it does seem quite effective. And these are just some guidance they're guidance documents that could inform your approach to this type of work there, if you are interested in reading further. And again, I do run more detailed training on this type of thing. So you've done your desk study, you've done your initial site assessment, and you've decided that you need to do surveys for invertebrates. It's a site that's super duper, it's like a brownfield or a beautiful peatland. So these surveys need to be designed and led by invertebrate specialists. It's just too big an area, too complicated. You need to have people who know what they're doing, I guess, which is true of anything in ecology or anything else. And you may want to target one or more indicator groups with large numbers of species, including those of conservation importance associated with a specific habitat. So what you would want is groups with a lot of species, a variety of conservation designations within that, where the ecology is well enough understood that it can be linked to particular habitats. A lot of invertebrates are not very well understood, and we don't really understand their ecological requirements, so this would narrow things down. So often, for example, spiders are a good group, or beetles, true flies, and it'll depend on the habitats that you've got, which you're going to select to target. And then you can compare that against SSSI criteria to give you some context. If multiple taxa are involved, so you're doing spiders and true flies, then you may need multiple invertebrate specialists, because there's no one person who's an expert in every group of terrestrial invertebrates. There's just too much. But there are people out there who are experts in a variety of groups. For the detailed surveys, you would need to use a range of survey methods, and I would recommend at least 3 field visits between April and October to cover different taxa. You'll need to decide on the timings based on what you're targeting, obviously, and where you are in the country and how high up you are. If it's 1,000 meters, that can affect your survey season, and more may be required. If there are target species, you need to make sure that you're going out at the correct time of year and you're using the right methods. You need to allow sufficient laboratory time for identification. So fieldwork is one thing, but it could take you several days of laboratory time to identify your specimens for every fieldwork day, depending on how many target taxa you've got. So you need to make sure you build that into your budget and your timescales. It's important to keep voucher specimens, so as any rare or difficult to identify species can be checked by experts or compared against reference collections. So it's important to have a reference collection. We have one in our office in Stirling for various groups. And these are specimens that have been identified, have been confirmed to be what they are, and we can compare other specimens against them to check that they are the species we think they are. And museums have fantastic collections as well. And with some difficult groups where there may not be good identification books available, for example, it may be the case that you regularly need to go to a museum to compare your specimens against their reference collections to confirm identity. Obviously, all takes time. And these are just some pictures of different collection methods. So this is using a putter to do active searching. So a putter is a tube that you put one end of the tube against the bug, and you've got a tube that you suck into on the other end, and a valve in between. So that allows you to get a bug into the tube without damaging it. It's very important to check that the valve is working though. I've had a few valve malfunctions in my time and swallowed quite a few spiders in particular. This is bug vac, so it's a leaf blower that's got a net on the end that's basically an industrial putter. It sucks up bugs, and the great thing about this is you can empty the net out into a tray. The bugs are still alive, they may be stunned, and you can select which ones to take. So if you're only looking at particular taxa, you just take them. You're just looking at spiders, you just take the spiders. And with some invertebrates, you need adults to identified species, for example, spiders again, in which case you can try to just take mature specimens and leave the immatures. That's a fantastic way of collecting invertebrates, very effective. A great way of finding, for example, this species, the bog sun jumper Heliophanes damphi, a rare jumping spider that occurs in peatland. But yeah, the bug vac is, I think, by far, if you're just going to use one method, it collects a great diversity of species. This is active searching with forceps, in this case on top of the Fannic Hills in the northwest of Scotland. It's a great way of delicately collecting invertebrates in cracks of rocks and whatnot. Sifting through leaf litter. Brushing the bark of trees to dislodge invertebrates. Sweep netting with a robust net, so that's bashing through vegetation, as my colleague Neil is a good way of collecting invertebrates. And this is Stephen Falk, who I mentioned earlier, using a more delicate sweep net on top of some mountains to collect flies. Sweep netting in water. So aquatic invertebrates, as I've said, that's a whole other talk, but some terrestrial invertebrates do actually hunt on the water, various spiders, for example, and so aquatic netting can be an effective way of collecting those. Pitfall trapping, this would be a cup dug into the ground, always with a lid on top to stop vertebrates from falling in, and it would contain antifreeze and some washing up liquid to break the surface tension, and anything that falls in would be preserved, and you'd maybe collect them after 2 to 4 weeks and see what you've got. The downside to this collection method is it does kill anything. So if you're only looking at spiders, you're going to get beetles and centipedes and all sorts, and it will kill them regardless of their age, so it's not selective. Water traps, so this would be a bowl that's in a particular color to mimic flowers and filled with water, again with washing up liquid to break surface tension. And you would leave this out for a period of time and various pollinating insects will land on it and end up trapped in the water for you to collect later. And moth trapping, these photos are from India actually, so everything else has been from the UK so far, I think, possibly a picture from Sweden in there. But we've done some work in India with moth trapping in the last couple of years, which has been really interesting, and I just thought I'd throw these pictures in because they're more exciting than ones from Scotland potentially. So we've got two kinds of moth traps there. We've got a moonlander moth trap on the left, which is a more modern moth trap, which is quite effective over short distances. So it's good if there's high densities of moths. So it works well or better in tropical places than it necessarily does in Scotland. But it's very portable. And then on the right, we've got a heath trap, which is less portable, but still portable, collapsible, but runs off of a car or golf cart battery. And then you get even more industrial moth traps than that. This is a bark trap, so this is a double layer of bubble wrap with black plastic to keep light out that you would wrap around a tree, and you'd leave it for a month or so and come back, and invertebrates that would live within the gaps of bark or underneath the bark move and live in the plastic, so you can take that off and collect them. It doesn't get a huge diversity of species, but what it does get is very hard to find any other way. And this is an example of the lichen running spider, a rare spider, which can be found under bark traps. Nest traps, so these are the sorts of things that people sometimes put out for bees in their garden. They're not always very effective for bees, but they can be good for other things, such as rare spiders. And this is a flight interception trap, so it's a bit like a pitfall trap in the sky, hung from a tree, and invertebrates fly into those windows, bash down into the antifreeze, and they can be collected in a couple of weeks or 4 weeks. And there's also collecting material and rearing things on at home or at the office or in the lab. So this is an example of a moth that was thought to have gone extinct on Arthur's Seat back in 1982, and we were asked to go and survey for this moth, and one of the methods that we used was collecting the food plant leaves where they looked like they may have been mined by moth larvae and rearing those on. And we did in fact end up with several adults emerging, showing that the moth was not in fact extinct after all. And this is it, the stonecrop fanner moth, Glyphipteryx equitella. This is pretty. So after all of that, hopefully we're at a point that we can revisit these photos from earlier. So which of the sites do you reckon is likely to support invertebrate communities of conservation importance and require detailed surveys? Well, I would say that the woodland, broadleaf woodland with deadwood would probably necessitate invertebrate surveys, depending on what the purpose of the land use change is. Caledonian pinewood, similarly, detailed surveys I think would be required. Brownfield sites, also surveys would be necessary. This area of grassland has varied structure with various different wetlands. Habitats could support particularly interesting tools, so surveys would be recommended. The bog habitat peatland could support invertebrate communities of conservation importance. Montane habitats may not support great diversity, but they do support a lot of species of conservation concern, so would warrant survey. This area of wetland with willow would similarly warrant further survey, as would the vegetated shingle. In conclusion, invertebrates are a major component of ecosystems, and they are the foundation of most ecosystem services. And there's legislation and conservation importance which can provide a framework for their consideration. And they considered, in terms of an ecological impact assessment, you could consider invertebrates as a component of the habitat, or you could look at communities and use SSI criteria to help you with context there, or you may look at species, for example, that marsh fritillary, depending on the circumstances of your project and the species likely to be present. And a staged approach ensures proportionate surveys. So initially undertaking a desk study, then depending on the results of that, possibly an initial invertebrate site assessment with an invertebrate expert, and that may or may not recommend further surveys that could target particular taxa using a variety of methods. And that's the end of that presentation. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. Do you want to pop your camera back on? Hopefully got your details there if anyone wants to contact you. Very impressive to get through 81 slides in half an hour. Well done. So I've had a few questions. There are three quite similar ones, actually. I'll ask them all, but they're all pretty related, I'd say. So this is from Mark Tunmore. Part of the problem in justifying the costs of invertebrate surveys to clients is that there are so few legally protected species, which is true. And there is a view that therefore they don't need to bother as there is no risk. Are there any moves to add more species to the Wildlife and Countryside Act? I know Bugleaf were looking at this in the past. And do you have any tips for how to deal with this perception amongst clients?
Sure. So over the course of my career over the last 20 years, invertebrate surveys have become more of a thing than they were at the start, for sure. So things are going in the right direction. I think in terms of legislative drivers, the biodiversity duty is possibly the strongest one for looking at invertebrate communities. Obviously, in terms of ecological impact assessment, scheme guidance and all that, the framework within which you're considering impacts isn't legislatively driven. You need to consider legislative factors, obviously, but that's not how you determine importance. So objectively, you should be considering invertebrates if you feel they are of importance in your professional opinion anyway. But I get that that's not always easy to sell to a client. So the biodiversity duty is where I would focus personally, and normally do. Different planning authorities, in my experience, are variable in their consideration of invertebrates, although that is improving as well. So some areas of Scotland, for example, there may be contentious sites where invertebrates have been a big deal, and organisations like Buglife have really raised their profile. And those planning authorities tend to flag up invertebrates as something to be considered more frequently than others. And hopefully as that information spreads, it will become more of a thing. I've also noticed, particularly in Scotland, that since there was the introduction of the requirement for biodiversity enhancement, rather than just keeping things the same, so net gain, planning authorities have been flagging up invertebrates more frequently as well. So I think there's a link there too. But yeah, I think biodiversity duty, if you don't have a protected site or a likely legally protected species, are probably your strongest legislative drivers.
That's interesting you talk about net gain. So another question is, do you think that BNG would represent an opportunity for invertebrate conservation? You know, we as a responsible body see loads of designs of habitat banks with habitat management and monitoring plans. Obviously, it's designed towards habitat mainly, but you do get some of those where they're deliberately designing features in for invertebrates. So it does seem an opportunity to me.
Yeah, no, I think BNG is actually a fantastic opportunity for invertebrates. Again, it requires people to consider them and to build them in, but it's something that I've seen a lot more over the last few years in particular. And I've also noticed that landowners are considering invertebrates, I think, in terms of the biodiversity offering of their land and potential biodiversity credit sort of systems down the road as well, where we're asked to do invertebrate surveys of various sites and also used for monitoring of improvement of habitats in different sites as well. So I've seen more invertebrate surveys being asked for since BNG's come in.
It's funny, like you, I've been doing this for a very long time. And in the early days, an invertebrate survey was basically half an hour looking for butterflies and possibly dragonflies if you're lucky. And it does seem to have evolved quite a lot over the last 20, 30 years, which is good. But it is still something that you get pushback on for the reason for that first question.
Yeah, I think it's potentially it's a big unknown for a lot of people, and it seems like a really big thing. Like 98% of all known species of animals in Scotland are invertebrates. That's a lot, but it doesn't need to be as bad as it sounds, if that makes sense. There are proportionate ways of tackling it. In the vast majority of cases, it's unlikely you're going to need to do detailed invertebrate surveys, and if you do, you can target those, and it's not as big a deal as you might worry that it is. It's just a case of involving the right experts at an early stage to get that advice.
Yeah, and I was going to ask that because there's a question here, which is, hold on, let's see if I can find it. How experienced do you need to be in order to effectively carry out an initial invertebrate site assessment? And that's related to what you were just saying. There is a dearth of expertise in this across the country. There are not many people that can do the stuff that you do. So to that end, that initial site assessment, can that be done by someone who isn't, an out-and-out invert geek?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why not. I think there's probably a level of training that would be beneficial to provide, because it's not necessarily always intuitive to people who are used to looking at vertebrates or botanical interest. There may be features that you just don't consider, like bare earth or whatever the case may be. So I think a degree of training is useful for that, but I don't think you need to be an absolute invertebrate specialist to be able to identify whether a site is likely to support invertebrate communities of conservation importance.
There was an excellent book, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. Peter Kirby, do you remember his book about invertebrate habitats? Yeah. Fantastic, very beautifully illustrated. I always felt that was fantastic and could be used by someone who is, a broader ecologist. It set out all of the different features you might have in the different broad habitat types that you might be looking for. I think it was an RSPB book, kind of A4 size. I'm not sure if it's still in publication, but it was. I always thought that was extremely helpful.
I think as well, there's opportunities with UK Hab potentially as well down the road to build elements of this into that assessment. It's something that I have had an interest in for a bit, but I've not really had the opportunity to properly explore.
Well, it's not really come north of the border, is it, particularly UK Hab? Or has it?
It's not really, no. I'm sure it'll get here in the end.
It'll get there. This is an interesting one. At what point would you consider further invertebrate surveys of hedgerow habitats? What features, species, or conditions would you be looking for?
That's an interesting question. I think everything I would take on a case-by-case basis, but where you've got a mix of native species and connectivity to woodland habitat in the wider landscape, I think I would probably be looking at invertebrate surveys, or if there are like veteran trees within the hedgerow that have deadwood features, that would be something that might flag up consideration. And I guess it's always in the context of the environment, because if there's not much like that in the wider environment, it might be particularly important. Whereas if there's a lot of that in the wider environment and some fantastic expanses of woodland, it may be less important in the local context, but then it could support more interesting communities. So yeah, it's just going to take professional judgment.
There's a similar question from Chris Ennis, who's in my team actually, who says, it sounds basically that every habitat can be worthy of a specialist invertebrate survey. Are there any habitats that you would advise not to bother with? There was a sense of that when you went through all of those slides at the start. I thought, yep. I don't know, improved grassland, arable, but even arable is field margins, right?
Well, potentially, yeah. I mean, it depends on your landscape. I wouldn't often focus on arable in the sort of landscapes I tend to be working in, because there's fantastic examples of peatland and woodland and stuff usually also. And if there's lots of pesticide use, it's probably not going to be as good. But it depends on your site context. What's important in Scotland may not be the same as what's important in south of England.
I think we're going to have to end pretty much there. Let me see if I can just find one more which is sort of related. Yeah, with Rachel Reeves talking about time-wasting bat surveys, what chances are there for detailed invertebrate species being promoted for major project development? I mean, you're more likely to get it for major projects, frankly, I'd say, where there is bigger impacts, bigger budget.
Well, I mean, I have to say, we did quite a lot of invertebrate surveys for HS2, and the surveys done for that we undertook were really thorough, and all of our recommendations were taken on board in terms of survey effort and methods. So yeah, I guess we also had Keir Starmer blaming a spider for something it hadn't caused recently as well. It wasn't even found in the place he was complaining about, but never mind. And certainly when I was planning casework officer at BugLife in the past, I was involved in a lot of projects, and invertebrates, causing the potential extinction of invertebrate wasn't considered a material issue legislatively for developments unless they were legally protected. So I think, yeah, it's a bit of an unfortunate situation. But hopefully things will improve in terms of everyone's outlook on wildlife and whatnot.
It does seem there's quite a lot of bias against invertebrates. When you think how many species there are, as you said, a lot of them quite rare, that so few of them are protected. Look, Chris, we're going to have to leave it there. There are a few more questions, but I think you said to me earlier you'd be happy to answer those offline. So if your question hasn't been answered, Chris will get back to you. That includes the person who asked for the slides. I'm sure we can get a PDF of the slides over to you. This has been recorded, so you'll be able to see the slides again in the recording. Next month's presentation is by George Wilkinson from RSK Biocensus. And his talk is entitled Birds, Surveys, Impacts and Mitigation. So that's another one to really look forward to. Just to thank Chris again for a fantastic, very interesting presentation, and also to remind everyone that you will be getting a feedback form in about an hour's time by email. So it would be great if you could respond to that. Otherwise, that's it. Have a great rest of the evening. Hopefully it's sunny where you are, and have a good weekend too. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. Bye.